Charlie, I'd like to talk a little bit about Catholic social teaching, and especially what we call these days the preferential option for the poor. But we need a little background to all of this. I know the Catholic bishops in the United States are asking us to talk about Catholic social teaching, especially in this year 1991, the 100th anniversary of the issuance of the first great Catholic social encyclical by Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum. And in doing so, the bishops, in one of their statements, said that they could discern at least 6 fundamental themes and principles in Catholic social teaching. They talked about the life and dignity of the human person, the rights and responsibilities of the human person, the call to family, community, and participation, the dignity of work and the rights of workers, and the theme of solidarity. And in that listing of 6 major ones, they said one is the option for the poor and vulnerable, that they have a special place in Catholic social teaching. So I think that we need to explore that theme a little bit. There's, of course, a whole history of it. I suppose you could say that all the way back, starting with Rerum Novarum, you begin to get an option for the poor because the Pope took a very special stance towards the poor working people of his time in 1891 and sided with them and championed their right to organize into labor unions and so on. So one way of doing this is to sort of trace the way that the poor have been treated throughout all of the Catholic social teaching of the last 100 years. In fact, there's a fairly well-known book that has done that by Donald Dorr. He has tried to trace all of this throughout, and that book is called Option for the Poor. It's Orbis, came out in 1983. But that might begin to set the historical stage here for this discussion.
Jim, I think certainly it's been not only a thread of that 100-year pattern of Catholic social teaching, but it's also a thread in a much longer sense in terms of the scriptural roots of the whole Old Testament theology of a God who in some way was seen to especially champion the cause of classically the widow, the orphan, and the alien, the poor, the disadvantaged, the people without status or position or any kind of security in society, and almost in a sense that those who had nothing else on which to rely and no other source of protection or security to which to turn, it was precisely a sense of a calling to turn to God for that security and protection that others found in social status or economic wealth or political power, military power, whatever it may be.
Well, that's a great starting point. Yeah, there's an option for the poor already within the Hebrew Scriptures, in other words.
Right.
The widow, the alien, and the orphan, representing those people who were marginalized and in trouble. And a great prophetic call to attend to them. In fact, the prophets had harsh words to say for those who did not think about the poor and who were oppressing the poor. Remember Amos talking about the fat cows of Bashan, the wealthy women who were not taking care of the poor and were using their wealth for their own well-being.
It's also kind of interesting to recognize that as we look at contemporary social issues in the 1990s, to a great extent, if one looked no further than the widows, the orphans, and the aliens, you'd have a fairly good constituency. The issues of children in poverty in the United States, issues around women in the workplace, women's rights, the whole issue of dealing with the issues of the alien, whether it be, extremely currently Kurds in Iraq or refugees, political and economic refugees in so many parts of the world. There seems to be a consistent pattern in human history that the widow, the orphan, and the alien tend to be on the short end of things. And so in that sense, too, it's not simply kind of a newfangled idea that the Catholic Church came up with recently. This has a long base not only in the doctrinal basis of the Church, but in the reality of how we humans structure social life.
Indeed, and that's very important in Catholic social teaching, always to deal with the reality, almost a natural law kind of approach. What is reality telling us about the situation? Read the signs of the times has been the modern way of saying that. You mentioned the Hebrew Scriptures. We'd also go back to the New Testament and see the teaching of Jesus. We especially Luke's Gospel would be very helpful in all of this. Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor." Notice in Matthew's Gospel it says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." In Luke, we hear, "Blessed are the poor." And that sort of is a theme throughout Luke's Gospel. In fact, Mary, in her great Magnificat in the early chapters of Luke's Gospel, rejoices in a God who raises up the poor, as it says. And Jesus, when he begins his public ministry in Luke 4, identifies himself with the one who will preach the good news to the poor, recalling Isaiah to mind. And so, and then you've got all of those woes against the rich. He warns his followers against greed, and he tells the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. So Luke's gospel is just filled with that kind of thing. I think one of the theories is that in Luke's community that he wrote to, there was a disparity already between those who were better off and a poor element, and it seems as though Luke already had a preferential option for the poor as he wrote his gospel, saying there's these woes upon the rich people who don't look to the poor. And the parable of the rich man and Lazarus really brings that across in striking fashion.
I think what I have found, Jim, is that the very key to an understanding of kind of the feel for that principle of an option for the poor is not so much a question of a position that stands against wealth, against affluence, against the rich, but rather a position that says in a society that consistently, be it contemporary or ancient society, places the value of people on what they've got, their status, their position, that doesn't give very high social standing to lepers and women of the streets, and the other scum that Jesus was kind of considered to be associating with. The very core of the consistent Christian message has been that the fundamental dignity of person is something that cuts across that. And that Jesus' message was precisely one of, so you're not rich, you're not powerful, nobody else has any place for you. In fact, some folks would rather that you just went away. You are valuable to me. And that is a tremendously positive message of affirmation, of hope, to precisely that person who, for whatever reason, finds himself or herself in space where they don't exactly feel that society puts them on any sort of a privileged niche, that they're scrambling to kind of keep up with things.
Yes, your effort to relate it to the current situation is helpful. I think of people who are on welfare now and feel as though they don't have a chance and feel powerless. Often the way the poor feel in our society is powerless. They can't get any place. They can't get things done. Can't get people to answer their phone calls. They're never sure by the end of the month whether they're really going to be able to feed their children properly and so on. So, I mean, there's all of that sense of powerlessness. And when they read the Scriptures, there's no doubt that the themes that jump out at them. I mean, all of these things about Jesus having a special care, reaching out to the outcasts, being interested in those on the margin, really make an impact on them. I mean, other people, we can, those of us who are in a comfortable middle-class existence, when we read the Scriptures, don't tend to see that as much. It seems as though it takes the prophets to call that to our mind. But when the poor actually do read the Scriptures from the viewpoint of their own plight, their own miserable situation, these themes do jump out. I mean, they're not going to miss Luke saying, "Blessed are the poor." They're probably not going to miss the Acts of the Apostles either when they begin to talk about holding all things in common and about the people coming together to help the others. There's a sense of solidarity in the Acts of the Apostles. Now, we know that's an idyllic picture, that, as a matter of fact, the early Christian community wasn't perfect on that issue, and it all didn't work all that well. In fact, the Acts of the Apostles has in it remembrance of someone who didn't contribute to the well-being and ended up falling over dead over this transgression. So it wasn't all perfect, and we have to remember that, but it does no doubt represent an ideal that the people would attend to one another, as you were suggesting, that no one would be left out. There would be a fundamental equality within the Christian community based precisely on the teachings of Jesus. Now, I'm saying that when someone today reads the Acts of the Apostles, they're probably going to latch on to that, and that was what will impress them.
I think they're going to latch on to it, Jim, perhaps especially if they read it not perhaps from the perspective of sitting there reading it in the waiting room at the welfare department, in Toledo or Los Angeles or New York City, but if they read it, sitting in a shack, in one of the barrios outside of Sao Paulo in Brazil or in Lima, Peru, and I'm thinking especially at the moment of Latin America, but also of so many parts of the world where the basic social and economic divisions are so much more extreme than they are here in the United States, where you have situations where 5 to 10% of the population control 80-90% of the productive wealth of the country, where being poor is a totally different reality than it is here in the United States, where poor doesn't just mean you don't have a very nice house to live in. It means you don't have any house to live in, where it literally means a day-to-day question of am I or any of my family going to starve to death? And I think it's precisely that social situation in Latin America which in a lot of ways is kind of especially underneath the specific option phrase here, because the gatherings of the bishops of Latin America at Medellin and then again 20 years later at Puebla in Mexico, it was their experience of precisely the life of their people, and a sense that to preach the gospel authentically to people that live in that situation has to preach a gospel that says that people in that situation are at the very heart of the concern of Jesus, and therefore have to be at the heart of the concern of the church.
Right, there's a strong scriptural base for that, isn't it, in Matthew 25, where Jesus identifies himself with the poor. Have you fed the hungry? Have you given drink to the thirsty, sheltered the homeless? And the implication being that that was me. You did that for me when you did it for the least of my brothers or sisters. And that really, in a Christian setup, sets up a really strong motivation. Mother Teresa played to that often. She's talked about seeing Jesus in the consecrated bread at Mass and equating that with seeing Jesus in the faces of the poor people, in her case, and the kind of people you're talking about being really poor. That is the people in the streets of Calcutta who were dying, who had probably lived on that street all their life without ever having shelter of any kind. So, I mean, there is a strong Christian motivation for carrying this out, the identification of the Lord with those who are poor and the outcasts.
I think there's also the fact that you very quickly get into the very basic distinction between a question of charity and a question of justice. The church has always had an image, and it's been responded to by the wealthy and affluent in the church, of charitable concern for the needy. We give generously in this church. We give to worthwhile causes. If there's an emergency, I remember some years ago, one of the earthquake relief funds, and funds poured in. We are a generous people. When you shift over and talk about the right of the poor, especially the right to the means for basic subsistence level issues of food, clothing, shelter, where the exercise of that right begins to even appear to infringe on what I hold and consider as mine, the conversation changes tremendously. And yet to talk about my obligation as a Christian to be charitable to the poor and the right of the poor man or poor woman, because of their fundamental dignity, their right to the essentials of life, the conversation changes significantly.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's an important distinction between justice and charity, and we certainly have a much harder selling job of the Catholic social teaching on the question of justice and rights than we do on other aspects of it, and that would be, you could do an analysis of that in the United States in terms of the Catholic immigrants coming to this country, and when they heard the Catholic social teaching in the beginning of this century, they were thrilled by it because it spoke for them. The leaders, the bishops, were saying something that they felt needed to be heard. They were on their side, championing their rights to organize into unions, to have some sort of social security, as the bishops called for in 1919 in the United States. So it's sort of, hooray, our leaders are right where we want them to be. They're on our side. They're speaking up for us. But now, when we look at our situation today in the United States, where Catholics have become the most affluent Gentile people in our country, it becomes a different story. Now, I think our church is divided roughly into three quarters who have made it into the mainstream and who have become the most affluent Gentile groups, our ethnic Poles and Irish and Germans. And on the other hand, we have the 1/4 of the new immigrants, the Hispanics largely, who find themselves on the margin. So I suppose they hear the Catholic social teaching today and the bishop's economics pastoral in a far different way than the mainstream Catholics do.
When the great-grandson of that immigrant now is the very successful owner of a multi-thousand-acre agribusiness in California and finds that same church siding with his Hispanic farm workers and their right to organize, it's It's a whole different conversation.
Yeah.
And we forget the fact that where the church stands with some groups today is exactly where it stood, with a pattern of groups, over certainly the last 50 to 100 years in the American social development situation. The other thing is that where the church stands, the church is a public institution. It's not simply a question of the private behavior of individual men or women, be they lay people, clergy, bishops, whatever, but it's a public institution. And where the church as institution is perceived to stand in its policies, what it supports, what it advocates for, what it keeps silent about, is perhaps, I don't know, in some ways in the age of contemporary communications, perhaps even more significant than how the church's institutional positions were seen to stand 20, 30, 50 years ago. I think especially in Latin America, where the church has to stand either with the rich or with the poor. There is no middle ground, and that's an awkward stance in which to try to figure out where to be.
That's right. I think that distinction you've been making between Latin America and the United States is crucial. This notion of the option for the poor, preferential option for the poor, really got its currency at Medellin, as you suggested, Colombia. We know that from the drug world these days, I guess, all too well. 1968, the Latin Americans bishops meeting, very important conference, often cited and produced a lot of documents and so on, but they saw what we'd call the massive structural injustice in society, and they accepted the obligation to be in solidarity with the poor. So it was a structural question. The whole thing isn't working right. So they said, well, what are we going to do? Let's educate the poor so they are aware of the causes of their own poverty, and then help them to organize to overcome injustice and to achieve liberation. That was sort of the program. Help raise the consciousness of the poor, help them to reflect on their own situation in the light of the gospel, and empower them, help them to take hold of their own lives, because there doesn't seem to be much else to do. And you pointed out 5% of the people own 85% of the wealth, or something like that, roughly.
I think, too, the idea that when you talk about empowering people, either it envisions a scene where things are just kind of drifting and nobody's in control and somebody's kind of sort of got to grab hold and be responsible, or you're talking about a situation, which is more frequently the case, where the power rests with a small group in society, and the way that they exercise that power has a significant impact on the large majority. I think that it's a very simplistic example, but I remember someone once in a workshop pointing out that if I and 8 or 10 other people are somehow stuck on this 100-acre island, and that's enough ground, and it's fertile ground, we can, grow enough food to feed ourselves. And if little by little, in very legitimate, open, above-board deals, I buy up the land holdings of everybody else, of the other 9 in the group, well, that still may be okay. But if on the basis that I now own the island, I decide I'm going to pave 90 of the 100 acres, the other 9 people are going to very legitimately say, wait a minute, but that doesn't leave enough room for us to raise food to eat. And they've got a very legitimate concern. And it's that kind of sense that when I use what I legitimately own, it's not that I've stolen it or I've abused, where I use what I legitimately own in a way that somehow structurally blocks others from access to minimal subsistence kinds of issues in terms of literally food, clothing, shelter, let alone luxuries like medical care, education, personal development, then that structural situation calls for attention. It has to. The analysis you use, I think, is much debated. A lot of it goes under that heading of the theory of dependency, that somehow countries who end up getting dependent on the United States as the one who's gobbling up all of this and then enters into trade relationships, or we buy up their resources and so on, that's what adversely affects their economy. Now, there's other economists who don't buy this theory of dependency, that they will point to situations like this and say, well, we trade a lot with Japan, and Japan flourishes. We trade a lot with the Pacific Rim countries, and their economies are doing well. So that you can't just say because we are in a trading relationship and buy up coffee from Colombia, that this is what causes the problem. Now, you're going to get argument on each side, but I'm just saying that structural analysis, which I think was contained in the Medellin conference in '68, and perhaps somehow repeated in Puebla in Mexico in 1979,
which where they thought through that question again. Maybe it was muted a little bit there. But it's important to remember that that is a disputed kind of question. What is the structural cause of this poverty? And some of our economists would say, well, it really isn't the problem. They can be well off trading with the United States. Their problem is that they aren't structured right there, that they're not don't have the proper economic institutions within their own country. And that's they haven't used their resources well, and they've got this horrible oligarchy where there's these wealthy people who are exploiting everybody else, that's the real problem. So I think we should at least advert to that difference and debate.
And I think it creates a different kind of call to the Catholic, where at this point the Catholic businessman, college professor, communication specialist sitting there on Sunday morning is not simply called to reach a little deeper into his or her pocket and support the local charity contribution, but to use precisely their gifts and talents in the field in which they have expertise to contribute to precisely the kind of social analysis in terms of, okay, why is the situation the way it is? Who stands to benefit from maintaining the status quo? Who stands to lose if someone suggests a change in the status quo? Because that very quickly identifies where the power sources and the resistance points are in that entire schematic, if you will, of how, whether it be a particular industry, a particular bilateral trading relationship between the United States and a particular country. But it's not at all to suggest that each and every nation of the world can somehow be totally and completely self-sufficient in terms of all basic needs. The world community just isn't split up that way.
Can't do that, right.
Can't do it.
You also point out there, I think, that the structural analysis in the United States is going to be quite different. And one of the problems has been, can we take this Latin American theology of liberation with its theme, the preferential option for the poor, and simply import it into the United States, into a different structural economy? And I think many people have felt, well, you can't do that. There was a big debate, if you remember, at the time in the 80s when our bishops were working on the various drafts of the economics pastoral on this very phrase, the preferential option for the poor. Can you really use that or not? Or is that going to alienate the middle class? And is it, we look at all the trouble the middle class has in our country making it these days. And we got people in the mainstream working 2 jobs to put children through college. You got old people trying to make it on Social Security and who've worked all their lives, been gainfully employed and so on, or widows who are having all this trouble. So we get a very different structural situation here. I think it's interesting that the bishops, as a matter of fact, did stay with the phrase in the document, in the economics pastoral. It's in paragraph 52. They say such perspectives, that is talking about Jesus and the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, say such perspectives do provide a basis for what today is called the preferential option for the poor. And they do point out that Jesus did take the side of those in need. So, and there is a way in which we as followers should see things from the side of the poor and the powerless. Let's not forget them or leave them on the margins. We should help them experience some sort of the liberating power of God in their own world. To do this, they suggest, requires some sacrifice on our part, those of us who are in the mainstream. So what I'm saying is that you can't just import Latin American analysis, and yet our bishops do believe that there's a legitimate way you can talk about preferential option for the poor here in the United States.
You can import the need to analyze rather than simply accept a given status quo. It also very easily leads into another area that we might explore, and that's the whole question of the concept of solidarity. Namely, that if I see those poor folks as somehow my enemies, and I said there's an alienation and an opposition there, I'll go at it in a different way than the way I deal with exactly the same question if somehow my brother-in-law loses his job or is going to lose his house. When it's somebody that I identify with as being, they belong to me and I belong to them, we go at the analysis very differently than we do across adversarial kinds of relationships.
The solidarity theme is a crucial one in Catholic social teaching and blends in, I think, very well here with the preferential option for the poor. I think it's very important in all this to realize that the bishops, and I think the authentic teaching here, do not mean to exclude anybody. It's not like God loves poor people and hates middle-class Americans. We can't get into that sort of thing at all. This whole idea isn't an ideology, nor is it a way of favoring a particular group, but rather it's a principle we would use to criticize any system and always, whatever the system is, to be attentive to those who are left out, to those who are on the margins. So it's like putting on the mind of Jesus, who had special care for the outcast, but without ever neglecting the rest of the people. And so I think the bishops rightly sort of slanted the document in their later drafts to make sure they understood the real situation of middle-class Americans and the Catholics who have made it in this country. We're called upon to help out, but it's not a question of saying that the middle class is unimportant.
I think the call of the Church to stand with people across that spectrum, as you say, to not say, well, you're evil because you're rich, which certainly is not at all the Church's intention there. And perhaps it can be simply the fact that when somebody gets invited to the poor man's home and the rich man's home for dinner, we still don't quite know how to deal with that. They didn't know how to deal with a Jesus who went to rich people's homes and hung around with lepers. And it may be that kind of situation, simply because we don't understand it and it stretches us, may be one of the best things that the Church can contribute to the whole analysis, that it goes at it a little different way, and the fact that folks can't exactly figure out why the Church does that is what invites some further examination. I
think that brings in the whole situation of our parishes, because in our parishes very often this three-quarters affluent group is side by side with the one-quarter that hasn't made it yet in the United States, and parishes become a microcosm of the society and a place maybe where you can deal with some of that concretely, where the well-to-do can help other people find jobs, where they can be in solidarity with them in very real ways. And we're worshiping together, we see that. Well, Charlie, we've been pursuing this idea of the preferential option for the poor in Catholic social teaching. It is a key idea. It turns many people off, but it really does point to us to remember to put on the mind of Jesus. Jesus had special care for those people. If we're going to be his disciples today, we have to be caring for the poor, but without ever neglecting the rest of the people.